Throwaway for some obvious and not so obvious reasons. I'm on mobile, so I'll apologize now for spelling and grammar mistakes. Any mistakes in technical terminology would be due to my not knowing the English/German translation for some words and phrases. My grandfather was a Nazi soldier. He is still alive and has told some stories, though he doesn't talk much about it. He joined at the age of 17, spring of 1940, just before France was invaded. He didn't join because he held fascist personal beliefs, but because he was poor, had finished high school, and couldn't afford university. He has no quote-unquote horror stories about his first year. Army boot camp is Army boot camp, no matter what era or country you're in. After finishing boot camp, he was a grunt. Although he was in Germany, he was not deployed for active duty, but rather carted from base to base to work for soldiers who were out fighting. Most days consisted of meal prep, cleaning, and filing records. He was a hard worker and an obedient teenager for a few months before he got his first orders. During the siege of Leningrad, he got orders to accompany several other men to an undisclosed train stop, where he and the others escorted, quote, far too many passengers from one train, end quote, to the gates of Auschwitz. After the gates had closed, with the train passengers inside, he was sent back to the train stop to wait for more people. This was his job for approximately 3 weeks. He says some days several overpacked trains would come through. Some days he would see no one. He describes the days where no trains came as the worst days. The days with no trains left their post eerily quiet, forcing them to listen to the screaming and gunfire coming from inside the gates. In the late summer, he received orders to head to a camp for additional training. He and 5 other young men from his group were picked up by a high-ranking officer and driven for several miles to a camp. He said the officer was very kind and told all the young men in my grandfather's group they were headed for big things and guaranteed advancement. On the ride, they passed my grandfather's parents' house. Grandpa lived at this new camp with the 5 from his group, about 20 other older men, late 20s, early 30s in the age, and 4 higher-ranking officers. He said everyone was nice and considerate of each other. There were even days where they would play football, soccer, and board games. The officers didn't talk down to anyone in the group. Everyone was treated equally when they were not in training. Around this time, he got comfortable and let his guard down. He thought maybe things weren't as bad as he had been hearing. After being at the new camp for about a month, Grandpa asked an officer if he could leave camp for a couple of hours. He explained his mother's house was only a mile or so away through a field, and that he'd be back before nightfall. The officer agreed, but insisted my grandfather be accompanied by 2 other soldiers. They immediately headed out, made it to his mom's house in about 30 minutes, and were given sandwiches and hugs to take back to camp. The other soldiers were appreciative, as were the officers, and this may have had something to do with a little bit of favoritism he received. A few days later, the officers and older soldiers had left. My grandpa and the 5 men from his trained guard group were left behind to clean. Grandpa was put in charge. After their work was finished, the others suggested going for a walk to enjoy lunch out in the sun. Grandpa was hesitant, but agreed. While they were out eating on the side of the road, all 6 were captured by Russians. Their weapons and gear were taken away from them. They were bound and put into the back of a military truck. None of them spoke Russian, and none of the Russians spoke German. Everyone was terrified. He says they drove for days, being moved from truck to train car and back again. Most of the ride was silent. Everyone was too scared to speak, not that anyone could understand each other anyway. He thinks they stopped on the 6th day of driving. It was nearing the end of summer in Russia, and it was cold. Each man from the group was given an old blanket and a pair of boots. They were led into the woods where they walked for almost a whole day. They got to a clearing that had an old house and a shed. The Russian soldiers knocked on the door of the home, and a woman answered. Grandpa doesn't know exactly what was said, but he thinks it was along the lines of, "We're putting prisoners in your shed. Feed them, or don't. Just don't let them leave." The 6 of them were locked in the shed on the edge of the property. This is where he lived for 5 years. Once a day, a Russian soldier would bring 5 bowls of water, with a potato, and a plum-sized lump of uncooked bread dough inside. They were let out twice a day to use the bathroom, which was just the outside wall of the shed. Once a month, they were given damp towels to bathe with. Everyone was sick. 2 men died within the first year. Grandpa says winter was the worst. They preferred using the bathroom inside the shed, because exposing bare skin to Russian winter air guaranteed severe tissue damage. One of the 4 remaining men went outside to take a piss, and his urine stream froze inside of his urethra. This man developed a kidney infection and died. His body was left in the shed with them for about 2 weeks. With only 3 men remaining and a corpse in the shed, everyone got sick again. Surprisingly, all 3 pulled through and went on to live another 2.5 years without much incident. At the 4.5-year mark, illness came over the shed again. 1 more man died. My grandfather took it upon himself to move the body towards the door to maybe signal the Russian soldier they'd like it to be taken away. The guards did not come with their meal that day, or the next. The weather was warming ever so slowly, and dead bodies tend to smell pretty bad. The other men in the shed began vomiting on a regular basis. 3 days passed without food. On the 4th day, a woman brought water and 3 potatoes. She noticed the body by the door, shook her head, and closed the door. She didn't remove the body, but she didn't take the 3rd ration with her either. Grandpa and his remaining companion were very grateful. Every day the woman would come with water and 4 potatoes. Once a day, for about 12 weeks. One day she came and opened the door, but she didn't carry anything with her. She left the door open and walked away, looking back a few times as she did. For 2 days, my grandpa and his friend stayed in the shed with the door open, leaving only to use the bathroom just outside the doorway. On the 3rd day, the woman came back. She stared at them and pointed towards the house. Several minutes went by, and my grandpa finally stood up and approached the door. The woman nodded and pointed to the other man, who also stood and moved forward. The woman turned and walked away, all the while pointing at the house. They followed her and eventually made it inside. She gave them a loaf of stale bread, a glass of milk, a shot of vodka, and new pants and shoes. Both men cried. My grandpa kissed her hands and her feet. The other man was unable to right himself after collapsing in tears. They ate like wild animals. They then attempted to clean the woman's kitchen and sitting room. She came in and smiled while handing them a newspaper. It was August 6th, 1945. After some communication with hand gestures and nodding, my grandfather and his friend slept on this woman's stove, which was still warm from the previous fire that was inside. In the morning they were given water and a potato, and hurried out the door. They walked together to the nearest city, stowed away on a train, made it back to Germany, and parted ways. Grandpa made it back to his mom's eventually, and was met with shocked stares, and eventually warmth and love. He stayed at home for a year, got healthy, and made the decision to move to America. He worked in a tool and die shop, then as a welder. He met my grandma, who broke his thumb when he extended his hand to shake, and then got married and had 2 kids. He doesn't tell anyone his story that isn't a part of his immediate family. He's afraid he can still be charged with war crimes. He mostly spends his days in the garden with his calico cat, drinking beer and eating potatoes. He loves potatoes.